It was a very instant response, so I think I can probably, jump straight into that. Well, look, good afternoon, everybody. Last session of the day. Thank you so much for your participation in the conference so far. It's been really fascinating and really engaging, and it's been a great opportunity to to reconnect with a bunch of people that haven't seen for a little while, also to meet some new people as well, and it's been a very worthwhile day from my perspective, so thank you. For those of you who don't remember or who may have joined us since this morning, I'm Tom Alves. I'm Head of Development at Ahuri, and it's my pleasure to be the facilitator of this final session. Now, joining us for the last session today, we have, and I'll bring up his portrait, Lasse Lind. He's an architect and he's a partner of the firm 3XN GXN, who is joining us virtually from Copenhagen in Denmark. We've had a couple of Denmark references already in the conference, so it's a fitting segue that we're going now to hear from somebody on the ground, as it were. Lasse's our final keynote, and he will talk a lot about work that he and his practice has been involved in Europe in particular. They do have a footprint here in Australia and in Sydney specifically, so there is a connection as well. He has some familiarity with our context also. When Lasse has finished his keynote address, I'll invite Alison, Scotland and Ralph Horne to rejoin me on the stage as we wrap up with a bit of discussion from some of the issues coming out of Lasse's talk and any final comments that we might want to make at the end of the day as we wrap this up. So, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce Lasse Lind. Lasse has a very deep knowledge of low carbon and circular design, and he's part of the board of sustainability for the Danish Association of Architectural Firms. And he works to bring citizens, politicians, businesses together to enhance the sustainable impact of the industry. Lasse, welcome. Thank you so much. We look forward to what you've got to share with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. So do I just share my presentation from here?
We are relying on you to share your slides yourself, so thank you. And I was impressed by the quantum of your slide deck, but I know that architects are great time managers, so I have every confidence in you.
Yeah, well, we'll see how we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I will aim to be pretty fast here. Do you see my screen now or my slides now?
Not yet, no.
No. All right. Why is that?
That's right. Take a breather. We'll get there.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing your screen, but not your slides. We're seeing your.
All right. Let me try again. Yeah. Here we go.
Teams interface.
Well, that's not too interesting.
That's looking better.
That's better. Great.
Excellent.
And do you see now?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Great.
Yep. We've got the slide.
All good.
We just needed in. Yep. Beautiful. Thanks. Off you go.
All right. Great. Thanks. Technology is working. All good. Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'm happy to participate here, and I'll give you a bit of an insight of some of the a little bit of an intro of who we are, and then I'll sort of dive into 3 research activities that we've been doing here from Denmark around sort of circular economy in housing and social housing especially. So just very briefly about who we are, if you don't know us, 3XN GXN, we're an architectural practice established here in Denmark now with 5 global offices and most importantly, 1 in Sydney, and around sort of 150 people working globally across different projects and different places in the world. So the majority of our work is sort of cultural and commercial, also a bit of resi, and we work sort of across the Western world and a lot in Australia as well. We are slightly different beast from most architectural practices in the sense that we do a lot of different types of work related to the built environment. So not only buildings, but also everything from product development to branding to sort of publications and sort of thought leadership. and how we channel a lot of the work, which is not traditional, let's say, building projects, is through GXN, which is what I'm sort of responsible for, which is our sort of research and innovation unit in the office. And the idea between 3XN and GXN is to take some of the problems that we find in our practice as architects and sort of funnel that through research projects and come up with new ways of thinking, new solutions, but also have this sort of feedback loop between our research and practice. So let our research inform our practice and vice versa. And GXN, I think what I'll talk mainly about today is our sort of interest in what we call circular design and circular economy, which we've been involved with thinking about and researching in for now more than 10 years. We started 10 years ago with a book called Cradle to Cradle for the Built Environment, and has sort of evolved our thinking around circularity since then. And increasingly are very much involved with research regarding the building stock from, let's say, the 60s and forward in Europe. And the Western world at large. And what is happening, which is quite interesting, is of course that we have a very large mass of buildings, roughly sort of built in the rise of the middle class after the Second World War, and from sort of the 60s and forward, that are now increasingly becoming sort of unloved, out of their time, obsolete. And of course that's a sort of a big challenge from a resource and climate perspective, and we do a lot of research around how to deal with these types of buildings. So I'll give you a couple of examples, three projects. First is called Resource Block.
Sorry, Lasse. Just there is a little issue with your display. It's not in the full screen mode. We're seeing sort of your next slide popping up. Apologies to interrupt your flow.
No, that's all good.
I think some people were just having trouble seeing your slides properly.
Yeah, so of course, apologies. Let me just see what I can do here.
You press display at the top of your screen, I believe, and go into presentation mode.
There we go.
Yeah, excellent. That's perfect. Thank you. Apologies for the interruption.
Yeah, my apologies. Thank you for that. All right, so let's see how we go. So the first example that I will give of a research project is called the Resource Block. And it deals with reuse of materials from sort of modernist sort of residential architecture that we have in Denmark. The background for this research project is a political initiative called Denmark Without Parallel Societies, kind of infamously called, labeled the Ghetto Package. And it is essentially a political initiative that was decided in 2019, which deals with social housing areas in Denmark. It has a series of kind of criteria that puts these areas on the list. It has to do with socioeconomic concerns. And what happens if the areas are on this list, let's say, it kind of unleashes a plan to change the markup of the housing in these areas. So essentially demolition of a part of the areas and building new in the same areas in order to change the typologies and change the ownership models to make more diversified areas. So I would say it's a very kind of controversial political package for many reasons. But what we were interested in as architects with this was that we can see that actually over the next 5 to 10 years in Denmark, a very substantial amount of buildings will be demolished, and that it seems as a paradox to, on one hand, have a 2030 target to be sort of carbon neutral and to try to drive our carbon from our general sort of procedures in with one hand from a political perspective, and then on the other, of course, knocking down from a technical perspective perfectly good buildings. So we wanted to have a look at that and see what can be done. We sort of accepted the premise that there are going to be some demolitions, but we wanted to understand, is there something that can be done to make sure that that what comes out of these demolitions in terms of materials are utilized in the best way. So this is just a scan of the buildings in question and when they are built. And what's interesting about these buildings, when you study them, is that a lot of them are actually built in the same way. They're prefab element concrete construction. And they consist of a lot of the same materials. This is one example of a building that we studied quite deeply, which is set for demolition. It's demolished now. But you can see this fairly typical sort of 60s, 70s prefab assembly line type architecture that was built quite fast in order to provide housing for people in sort of a housing crisis. So what we did was we went in and studied how are the elements placed, how are the connections looking. We studied the quality of the materials in terms of how are the materials actually doing, both in terms of toxicity, but also more sort of structural capacity of especially the load-bearing elements of the houses. And then essentially what we did was we made a sort of a material bank, a model that described all the potential materials. We worked together with demolition contractors on understanding what types of elements can we likely get out of this. What's the demolition sequence if we want, for example, box elements out, which we were able to in principle get out, and wall elements and slab elements. And so this would be then a kind of a material bank of the whole block. And then what we did was we gave that essentially that information to a series of architects and asked them to see how much of this they could reuse in the design for new buildings in the same area. Because what is happening is that they're demolishing the social housing blocks and then replacing them with more kind of load dense typologies. And this is I think quite beautiful example from one of our colleagues here in Denmark. This is our own design of row house typology, using a lot of both the box elements and some of the slab elements. And here you see that we calculated that from the materials part of the carbon equation, we would be able to actually achieve something like an 80% upfront carbon reduction compared to a normal similar new built house typology. And this is just a render we did from, you get this kind of, let's say, interesting meetings between materials, the new timber structure and the old slabs and planks and wall and elements used in the architecture. So it was a kind of a discussion piece. You could say, well, what do we actually, what is actually the potential of these kind of buildings as a material bank? We continue to look at that, because one thing is the principal, let's say, potential. The other thing is the practical reality of actually getting the materials out in a decent quality. Here's just an image from one of the tests done with the demolition contractors, and of course it's it's not easy. The first test we had, we were able to salvage something like 20% of here the hollow core slabs. The rest was actually destroyed. But kind of working with both testing how to store this and how to take it apart, and also what would be the sort of let's say the quality of them after you get them out. We were able to figure out a way to essentially get them out in a quality so that they can be reused again. This is sort of our first build test, which is just a pavilion with timber from a demolished building and planks from a demolished building, and this is of course just a kind of an urban furniture, so a low risk project, but essentially just testing out how to reuse some of these materials in a piece of design. So we are currently working a lot on understanding some of the next projects which are going down. The interesting thing is, as I mentioned, they are very similar in building technique. So once we begin to understand how to deal with this, you can see it's beginning to look much more organized. We are beginning to understand how to store these things so they don't break. And we are beginning to understand what level of kind of work, it requires to get them to a condition where they can be reused. And this is our latest attempt to sort of build them in. It's a transformation project that we finished in the outskirts of Copenhagen, an old warehouse, where essentially we built the mezzanine out of these old Holocaust slabs that you see here, which are now actually working quite fine and can be used as a kind of have a sort of second life, let's say. I just wanted to show this. I think a lot of people, I imagine a lot of people in the room would know this project, and just to say some of this this type of thinking around buildings, for some people it seems slightly science fiction like, but actually I think there's a lot of change happening, and of course it's interesting for me and probably for you, that probably one of the most complex and sort of thought through transformation and circular projects in the world is probably the Key Quarter Tower in Sydney, where of course it was more about reusing the structure as it is, which from a carbon perspective of course is even better. So I'll jump on to sort of what to sort of do with all the new build houses, and how we in a way prevent some of the things that we're seeing happening with houses from the 70s, where they are quite hard to change and quite hard to sort of adapt to the demands of our time. So this is a research project we did with 5 countries in the EU that is very much related to the circular economy policy, which is part of the EU taxonomy, which is essentially a piece of policy that is put on investors in order to meet their ESG requirements. And this, in the taxonomy, it also talks a lot about enabling building to be prepared for material recovery. And our hypothesis when we started this project was that all this stuff, we're building a lot of housing in Denmark and in the Western world in generally, I mean, due to urbanization, or around the world, I guess, due to urbanization. And our hypothesis is that essentially very little of this is in a sense has the capacity to change in the future. And we think this is a problem from a resource perspective. So what we did was we studied where in Copenhagen the main kind of development areas are, and how the kind of development of how many units are being built. And we see, of course, it goes up and down, but we have been in quite a high note in the recent years. Quite a lot of new construction of residential projects, and of course, this is what you don't want in the future. And what we are really seeing is that the general average lifespan of a building in Denmark is around 60 years. It's a bit lower for housing, but what we see is that the materials are actually often very fine. They could stand for much longer. But there's a lot of change happening, which is not driven by the sort of material quality of the buildings or the technical quality necessarily, but rather socioeconomic changes or market changes, a bit like we saw in the social housing projects, where it's not so much about the buildings themselves as it is about a political desire to wanting to change the social markup. So we studied the plans of all these new residential projects. How are they built? How are they looking? It's quite interesting when you sort of superimpose them on each other. What we found was that they're sort of almost eerily similar, which is on one hand, as an architect, slightly depressing, but on the other hand, it is also it's also potential that actually a lot of the stuff we're building in the residential sector, both freehold and rental, and to some extent also social housing, is very, very similar because it's kind of it's tailored to a very specific market, which is now, and a very specific demographic situation. So in a sense, we developed, you could say, an archetype of a building, and then studied how much does this actually cover of the new buildings that are being built, and then we look at how is it then built, and if we look at the sort of the demountability and the adaptability of how we build today in Denmark. So what we built is similar to how we build is similar to how we started building in the sort of industrial revolution with hollow core slabs, prefab concrete elements. But in a way, from a sort of demountability and adaptability perspective, it's not very great because everything is in a way glued together. Everything is tied together. All the layers of the building are inseparable from each other. So we developed based on that kind of basic apartment typology, a building system which actually in a way goes back to a sort of more old school way of building, where a lot of the structural loads are also kind of dealt with in columns instead of in load-bearing walls. So and of course in cores, and then sort of showing how could you, with this building system, much easier adapt to either bigger apartments or potentially in principle in the future also other types of typologies, in this case a commercial typology, so that you actually, when you build, begin to think about what is the transformation capacity of the sort of the housing units that we're building. And it's not something that's really on the agenda for a lot of developers in Denmark. It's not something they're thinking about. So this was a bit of a sort of a provocation to say, how can we enable our buildings to be much more multifunctional? How can we enable them to be reconfigured in the future? And ultimately, how do we enable that if it comes to that, they can be demounted or remounted, and it will be easier to take the materials out and reuse them should the market situation essentially change. So this was how we built today, and this is how we could build. And what we calculated was that from simply moving away from some of the very kind of cast connections that we have in buildings today, moving towards a hybrid system with timber and concrete, we could enable an 87% potential reuse of materials. And we did various types of sort of life cost calculations, and what we can see is that there was a slightly higher upfront cost, but as soon as, of course, the sort of changes of the cycle begin to happen, this is where this way of building is really pays itself off. Which is, of course, I guess one theme we could discuss. How do you kind of actualize that value? And this is just an example of then an exhibition that we did at the municipality in Copenhagen to sort of discuss with the politicians how all the housing that are being built, should we actually be thinking about this in a different way? Should we be thinking that perhaps we will be in a situation in just 10, 20, 30 years where perhaps the housing situation in Copenhagen will look much different than it is now, and how can we then prepare for that? So the last project I'll show is really quite sort of in a way technical designing, again for adaptability. It's in a way taking some of these ideas and trying to implement them in the market for social housing. The way social housing works in Denmark is it's social housing organizations who develop sort of social housing projects and then operate them as kind of non-for-profit organizations. And they have a cap, depending on where it is in country, for how much they can build. So essentially, there's a fixed economy. And we went together with one of the largest social housing providers in Denmark to try to do a concept for what we call Circle House. And the idea in Circle House was that 90% of all materials should be fully reusable. So we should build on market conditions with the way that we build social housing, but in a way so that we enable this kind of circular future. So it's a very big industry kind of collaboration with a lot of companies delivering in solutions and knowledge on how to make this happen, and also a collaboration between a lot of advisors and different architects. So it was not sort of our design or our project, it was more like an industry push to understand how we can do this. This is the book. It's open source, if unfortunately in Danish, so maybe not so relevant for you. But essentially, this is explained the principles behind it. This is an exhibition that we did. We built up the system around building layers, And I'll just show you a little bit about the project. It is outside the second largest city in Denmark, Aarhus, in a new build area outside there. It's these 60 housing units with 4 typologies. So essentially, the project itself is showing, you could say, quite different ways of 4 different ways of constructing this social housing. This is just a kind of illustration of some of the facades. And as I mentioned, we built it up based on this kind of layer diagram to say, well, we need to look at each building layer in order to understand how are they kind of separable from each other. How can we design them in a way so that things are not glued together, but kind of can come apart. And I'll just mention the kind of the biggest, I guess one of the big ticket items, both in terms of carbon and resource use, which is these hollow core slabs that we always use in Denmark, and which I've been talking a bit about, because those were in a way some of the hardest things, the superstructure of the building, the concrete elements. And what we did was we, together with industry partners, developed almost like a mechanical system of putting this together. And then instead of casting that out with cement-based mortar, we used a chalk-based mortar, which essentially enabled us to fire hose the connections, because you have to cast out these mechanical connections in order to secure for fire and soundproofing. But we were able to do that with lime-based mortar, so that actually within a few seconds you're able to kind of get the joint clean, and then you can assess it. So this is essentially how it works. It's very similar in many ways. It's very similar to how you could build houses today, but we've sort of harmonized all the elements so they are really simple from these 3 elements: a wall element, a beam element, and a slab element. You can build all these 4 housing typologies, and then in between those elements is sort of filled in with light buildings, so timber-based construction. And then these reversible connections based on lime mortar. So here you kind of see how these 3 elements stack up and become sort of a building system that can then be filled in with either windows or light wall elements of timber. And here's the mock-up that we built together with the Liable, the social housing company, where you see some of these solutions. This is we had a bit of a play with how the facades could be done. This is post-consumer plastic shingles. We also used these sort of brick type panels, which are also demountable. They are just fastened with sort of a strip on the back filling. And various kinds of funky materials, burnt leftover timber from the metro construction in Denmark, and cork, which can just be screwed off the facade. So a lot of things that we don't normally use in kind of housing projects, just to show that there is sort of a material paradigm out there which is ready to be explored. The status of this project is now that it was tendered out. After we did the research project, we went on the client side and then tendered the project out, and there was a winner of the tender, and they are now preparing to build the project based on these principles that was developed through research. Yes, and this is some images from the mock-ups with a lot of the materials we used. I think that was all for me. I hope I roughly made it on 30 minutes.
Your timing was perfect. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Lasse for that presentation. Look, thank you very much. I'm going to invite Ralph and Alison to join me on the stage here as well. And while they're coming up, Lasse, I've just got a quick question for you just about that last project you showed us, the Circle House project. Obviously, there was a prototype unit developed. You had the exhibition, a book, a whole range of, I guess, collateral material around that research. And you did mention that it is proceeding soon with a tender process to deliver a project. But can you just reflect a little bit on the, I guess, the role of research and of exhibition, that the actual sort of the publicity or the engagement process of it, and what role even just the fact of building a tangible prototype as well, like what role that played in I guess changing perception or influencing new practices.
Yes, sure, I can. I mean, for me, it's when we do these research projects, it's incredibly important that we get sort of a physical manifestations as well, and that as much as we can, we build something that people can kind of go and see and kick the tires a little bit on. And I mean, all of this, I mean, it's an ongoing discussion what we find most important in the built environment, and by having these types of research projects and these types of demonstrators, we sort of get a physical manifestation that can be tested, but also can be almost like an armature for that discussion, right? So we've had an incredible amount of visitors for this slightly, it's not a great building or anything. It's just a prototype that stands in a fairly uninteresting part of Copenhagen. But I mean, I think thousands of people have visited and talked to the social housing company and talked to us. So I think it's incredibly important to have that sort of physical manifestation. So it's not just a white paper, not just a report. Those are good, but if you can get it into something that's physical, it has just a whole nother reach. Is my experience, yeah.
Thanks for that. Alison, I'm interested in your thoughts in terms of your role here in Australia. What are your reflections on Lasse's talk and what he's shown us about some of those ideas that are being explored internationally?
Yeah, I think it's phenomenal, and I love looking to Europe because you really are the innovators. I mean, we had a conversation, Lasse, earlier today about the fact that, from an Australian housing perspective, the marginal changes to our minimum quality housing standards are standards that were achieved, well over 20, 30 years ago in Europe. So, we've got a very different minimum that we're working towards. And I think even just the components, the prefab components, I think we're really immature in some ways, but, lots to learn. I think the opportunity for Australia is we don't have to go through all of the, exploration, but we can actually adopt and adapt some really world-leading practices ourselves, and we can really don't have to go through the innovation pain. We can actually learn from our European cousins. I think it's really exciting.
Right. And Ralph, I did notice a picture of the Circle House prototype in your slide deck earlier. Obviously, that was one of the large number of projects that you examined as part of your work.
Thanks.
Can you maybe give some reflection on how you saw that? Just to segue from Lasse's talk, how you saw that project then fitting in alongside some of the other projects that appeared on some of your slides, which were of Australian projects. Can you reflect on some of the differences and similarities?
I don't want to sound like a giddy groupie here, but Lasse, I think so. The work is inspirational, and I particularly like the materiality, the way in which you just said, just this kind of performative element where I think that's a bridge to the broader social conversation. And we spent the morning, a part of the morning, talking about what's the size and shape and proportion of the conversation that's needed around circularity and circular housing, alongside the regulation and the kind of market transformation and all the other bits and pieces, the technical bits that we like to talk about. So that's the context, really, for comments I'm about to make. And I suppose if I imagine Circle House, not even that, but the reconstruction of elements, which is incredibly fascinating. That project in somewhere in Australia, I suppose the comments, questions, concerns that I imagine will be in play will be things like, who takes the risk here for these elements that have been pre-used, pre-loved, Who certifies it? How do we rethink standards so that these materials actually are allowed or permitted to be used, and again, risk all over that. And who funds the R&D? And of course, within that, rather clumsy, simplistic question is I guess the understanding that R&D is a collective endeavour. There's no point in government funding R&D if the sector isn't there wanting and co-designing and participating in a full way and committed, if you like, to the outcomes and seeing the outcomes being part of their future. So it's not a question of me here posing a question about who does it from a kind of deliberative dollars and cents perspective. It's much more about how are these coalitions to be put together. Those photos you showed of large numbers of people in a room, you know, what's the Australian equivalent and how is that put together? And I kind of look back across this panel towards Alison, who convenes one of, well, probably the collective that we would look to try to build those kinds of coalitions. So that's my 5 cents.
Well, yeah, thank you. And you raised a few questions there that I guess I probably would be interested in Lasse, hearing your response, particularly around that first project that you showed us, around those issues of risk that Ralph raised. I think that would be interesting to hear your perspective on that, and then of course to hear Alison's response to Ralph's challenge too.
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously a very relevant question, and there's certainly risks involved with a lot of this stuff, and we are pretty fortunate, I think, in Denmark especially, that we have a very good funding landscape for these types of things. We have a large philanthropical fund who is willing to play along with our kind of shenanigans on some of this stuff. So that helps a lot. I would say what we, in terms of managing the risk, our approach is. So there's a couple of things. We try to, when it's big commercial projects, we try to look for the parts of the project that are the least risky to begin with, because we always talk about this stuff or try to promote circular materials use. But we understand, you cannot start in the core construction, perhaps. I mean, it's simply too risky in certain projects. Regarding specifically the elements, for example, and the reuse of the elements, what we've done there is we've sort of developed a testing regime that enables that you can test one or two, and then they are allowed to, let's say, count for a larger batch, because you can sort of visually inspect them and say, okay, here, if these two are all right, it's also all right. But it's still something which the challenge is having the scale to make it stack up economically, and that has to do, I think, with a lot of different factors. It has to do with the price of, for example, the price of carbon. Is there any price related to not doing things circular or not doing things low carbon? Because there's not always. And the other thing is, of course, the development cost. And those, we are lucky, I think, that we've been able to fund some of those because there is a certain political will to move in this direction, and a certain understanding that there needs to be a development on the way there, right? But so just to maybe one of the questions you asked, I would imagine, from my knowledge of Australia, that probably be pretty a lot of people in the Australian sector who would be more than willing to engage in stuff like this if there were sort of the setup to make it happen. That's for sure my feeling.
Thanks, Lasse. And I love what you said about the testing of the components and sort of apply that manufacturing quality control, which is very different to our building quality control, and it happens at different times in the process. So I think from an Australian perspective, there's political appetite for exploration of these innovations, and I know, say at the political stage, that they love the idea of prefab, and I think their idea of prefab might need, expansion. So it's the elements I think are the most important. So for new builds, applying a more manufacturing quality control process rather than our typical regs, I think there's a political will to do that. I have a question back to you, Lasse, and it's in relation to existing buildings because, we are also struggling with probably lesser quality building stock. So it's the question about whether you renovate or rebuild and those circular concepts. I know, Roger, one of our speakers earlier, sort of mentioned the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and the question, there's a lower echelon for you can reuse materials but at a lower purpose. But potentially in terms of risk, maybe that's what we need to be thinking of in the building space, because potentially you might not have enough confidence in the structural elements to be used again in structures, but like you were doing, exploring different uses, so a podium instead, with less stress on it. So are you exploring, it's kind of the new side and also the old building side. Is that what you're thinking might work, that different type of reuse?
Yeah, I think from a sort of overall perspective, I think what we're trying to sort of grow and nurture is a much greater degree of care for essentially all materials, and that's in the sort of in the context of a sort of luring resource crisis, essentially. That I think we as a business should try to sort of think about all materials as potential resources, because we are sort of running out of them, essentially, or at least a lot of them, right? And that also means that if you have a fairly bad building from the 70s, which we often encounter, which is not a good building, it doesn't work for its users, it's maybe not very great, greatly built or whatever, even then to kind of exercise that level of care. And of course, there will be some buildings where, like with the Key Quarter Tower in Sydney, that had really good bones, so we could do what we did there. You won't always be that lucky, Sometimes it's a bad building and it doesn't make sense. But I guess a main point that I'm trying to stress is you should always exercise the care of understanding what the situation is. You should analyze it and figure out, what is the kind of appropriate way forward. And I think that, at least for us as architects, it's actually a fairly new process. I mean, it's not like I also have to admit, for us as an office, let's say 5-7 years ago, we would probably arrive at a building site and see some sort of maybe less interesting buildings and just like, okay, we're just starting over. Whereas now, I think we try to be very careful about how we treat whatever is on the site when we come there. So that also means that even if it's going away, try to understand what are then the material constituents, what are the routes for them to be recycled. Is there somewhere we can build them into our new project to save resources? All of those kind of conversations. So we would always rather keep as much of an existing building as we can, because that's usually, from a carbon perspective, in most cases, the best way forward. But I mean, it's case by case, right? What you can and what you should do. So I think the main message is to sort of exercise that level of care in a way. Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm keen to encourage some interaction from the floor. So please, if you do have a question, as previously, put your hand up and one of our microphones will come around. While I'm just waiting for that to happen, there's a question over here. I do just want to go back to you, Alison, on Ralph's other point about ASBEC potentially playing that role of marshalling the troops, as it were, and getting those sort of, what Ralph was referencing in relation to what Lasse showed, large groups of organisations, people coming together to solve, no one person actually, taking the risk and the glory, but doing it as a group. What are we seeing, and what's the prospect of that here?
Absolutely in scope, and I think for us it's almost been about baby steps in the sense of getting that long-lasting change. But we are acutely aware, and it's a very diverse membership within ASBEC. So you do have the leaders and the trailblazers, but you also have the builders and the manufacturers that have a lot of pressure on them. So it's trying to find that common ground. I think circularity is the exciting space where it's the culmination of everything, and it's just as much behaviour as it is systemic. And if we can showcase the amazing practices that really could work at scale, that's where it's really powerful. And the time is now, the opportunity is now. If we think about even the Future Made in Australia Fund, the built environment sectoral plans, I think we've got a very ripe and excited political will. We need to take advantage of that. So happy to continue the conversation about what it is we can ask government, because they need the solutions. So they're happy with a policy vision. Oh, we need to do this. We need to go circular. But I think it's up to us to really articulate
that
how.
next step of getting together and actually working out specifically what it is, or at least what the first step is, or the first few steps. Mike, thanks.
Thanks, Lasse, for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I chair a social housing provider, a not-for-profit in New South Wales. I'm interested in any reflections or comments you might have on the intersection with the planning system. How does the planning system cope with circularity and the reuse of products and materials? And whether you've got any experience from the AMP, the Q-Quarter, or from the project that's going to tender now in Denmark. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a kind of a very relevant question as well. So I think for quite some years, it didn't really matter that much in planning whether or not you did anything circular. But I would say now, especially, we work a lot in London and also in Denmark. It's really changing a lot. London has just adopted a series of circular economy policies. And essentially that means that anytime you go for planning, if there's any element of demolition, the project is put under extreme scrutiny, and you have to really show what you're doing. And for me, it's a really interesting example, because it's happened within 2-3 years, essentially, that the conversation has completely changed from I think a position where, and we've been working in London in those years, so it's been really interesting to see, well, okay, we are trying to have this conversation, but it's not really on the agenda. It's actually everyone really has to sort of, essentially when they're going for planning, account for their resource strategy and account for, if they have demolition, what are their kind of recycling routes and how much carbon are spent and saved and so on. So that's been incredibly interesting to see. I think for QQG, the interesting thing was generally that I think when the team started working on the building, they were not, and we were not supposed to say that it was a second-hand building. And now, of course, it's all everyone talks about, right? So there's been a kind of a profound shift, I think, in that period of time for how you perceive these things. So I think that's really interesting, and the same thing is definitely happening in Denmark, where we're seeing a strong movement, sort of a retro-first movement, like they have in UK as well, where that sort of uncritical approach to demolishing building is put under a certain degree of scrutiny and sort of public outcry. So I think it's changing fast, I guess would be my answer, which is quite interesting. But I'd encourage you to look at the actual policies that they employed in London, because they're quite interesting and they are really driving a lot of the market there. Yeah.
Other questions in the room? Yes, we've got one here. Yeah. And then one here afterwards.
Hello, Lasse. Yes, I want to say thank you as well. That was fantastic presentation, a very inspiring. I would, as an architect working in Europe, I want to ask your reflections on the fact that you have many old buildings in Europe that have stood for hundreds of years and in many cases have had multiple uses, how do you reflect upon having to demolish a building that was built in the 1970s? And what can we do about circularity when we've just talked earlier today about the longevity of a building is one of the best things that we can do?
Yeah, it's again, thank you. That's a very relevant question. And I think it's interesting because ultimately it's a cultural question, I think. You know, there are buildings that, of course, stand the test of time, and then because how they are designed and to some extent their technical quality, but ultimately probably because they are, you know, culturally valued. People like them and love them. And there is a challenge with a lot of these buildings from the 70s and even 80s we're seeing that they're just not, they're not culturally valued in the same way. People don't like them, or they don't perceive them as something that's worth keeping. And it is a challenge, and I guess my reflections on it are a little bit to the point I tried to make earlier. I think we are in a position now, culturally, where we cannot afford to treat them as some kind of, you know, byproduct of a time that we don't like anymore, or we don't perceive as kind of being beautiful or whatever. We have to take them seriously because they have embodied carbon, they have embodied resources in them, and we have to take care of them. And that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, that all buildings can be kept, but it just, I think, means that we have to begin to, I guess, develop a language to talk about these projects also as some kind of cultural heritage, or at least sort of environmental heritage, let's say. I hope that was an answer. I completely take your point. I think it's a very relevant discussion, and I think a lot of what will enable a larger degree of circularity is ultimately a cultural shift where we begin to understand materials as something valuable.
Yeah, thank you, and a really interesting question. Yeah, I think we had a question there. Was that right? No, you were just stretching. Ralph.
A couple of comments. I mean, just back on the conversation. I think. Well, for starting where this discussion is right now, I think this is really interesting. The kind of and the nature of the organisation that you're in, Lasse, I think makes this conversation quite interesting, because you're in a sense, you're in the shaping culture space. So you have this kind of branding responsibility you've given yourself, and that I think is really pertinent to this discussion. If we kind of think of other valuable objects in society, they often go through a phase where they are actually not valued at all. They're problematic. They fall into kind of the unfashionable, and then they kind of re-emerge. And there's no reason why modernist blocks from the 70s won't be, and I can almost predict this, that you know won't be in vogue and valued at some point. So the question is, how do we manage this? Not just manage in the sense of trying to come together and like you say, I can't really think of a better word than you've already used, care for what we have as already invested built environment stock. But the other part, and I'll come back to, you know, a point I wanted to make here is that care is not an individual thing. I don't have a rust heap broken down car and decide I'm going to care for it, and all of a sudden that changes it. It's actually something that's held in common. It's collective, that care. It's not something can be done on an individual basis. Just like behaviour change in buildings doesn't work. It's not an individual choice, actually. How many showers a day you have or whatever else. These are all, you know, culturally very much constituted, and consumption is culturally constituted, and care is culturally constituted. So we do this through a structuration process of kind of quite literally. And I think it brings me to my point about how you have brought these coalitions together around, you know, I guess standards and certification again. Have you got government at the table now saying we will put the effort into making sure that you can use these second-hand building materials, or you can repurpose the core of this building. This will be permitted, and these are the rules through which it will be permitted and why. At the right time, when the stakeholders around the table looking to take this risk, and you know, if it was convened by ASBEC or whoever else, there's a lot of moving parts that need to be moving in sync. And I think to pretend that this could be otherwise is a fatal error. So I suppose my, and maybe from the point of view of the tertiary sector, I'm a researcher in a university. I'm currently a lead investigator on a European funded project on positive energy buildings in Europe. The way that research is conducted in Europe is just quite different to how R&D is funded in Australia. We're required, we have a large consortium of actors. They're not just academics in industry, they are industry. We are building things, we are testing them, we are monitoring them. And funnily enough, we have a whole comms partnership around how we actually communicate and engage with broader society across Europe. So this is not something that's common to the kind of research and innovation or RDI model in Australia. And I suppose that's another thing about culture, how culture is co-produced. It's how people come to the table and what they bring. And a lot of the sector I'm involved in is largely, you know, behind closed doors. Even when it's CRCs and industry partnered, it's kind of part of the picture. It is not a kind of integrated culture producing, if you like, or at least not systemic and not kind of integrated. So I suppose the point I'm playing back to you here is, are there things we can do that, by shifting the dial in particular ways, that would make the kind of work that you are involved in more achievable, more feasible in Australia? So I suppose pivoting from thinking about, you know, taking the IP that you've generated and trying to kind of helicopter it in to our cities, thinking about how we can learn from and develop ways of doing that might achieve some of that. It's more of a comment.
Yeah. No, I maybe I just make I more or less agree with everything you said, and I completely think that I guess events such as this, where you come together and you discuss what is actually the important topics and how do you is part of a sort of like a potential culture creation, right? And I think that's what we're trying to do. We exactly as you explained, all our research is very cross-disciplinary. There's a lot of people involved. We try to maybe take a step back as the designers, let's say, and more try to facilitate a conversation which ends up in design. Because I mean, a small, you know, the Circle House project, which I'm very happy you showed as well. I mean, it's a 4 by 5 meters little thing. You know, it's nothing. You know, but it's all the people that were involved. It's all the thinking that went into it. It's all the communication that has been around it. And so in that sense, it's that's what we're trying to do as with our practice is to say, well, okay, we can design a lot of buildings, obviously, but we try to be part of conversations also with politicians that sort of hopefully is part of that sort of cultural evolution, let's say. Yeah.
Do you want to comment on that as well? Or?
I will, in the sense that you're so right, and I've always been of the view that what we have focused on at ASBEC has been the low-hanging fruit, as it were, because we're just trying to get little bits of change to improve the quality of our buildings in the existing system. Yeah. And what we see now is circular. You know, even embodied carbon. So embodied carbon theoretically can work within our current structures that we operate, current regulatory systems. So, you know, all the levers. But yeah, we see circular as just that new way of thinking. It's the next generation. It's really how do you instigate that cultural change in our existing institutions? And I don't know, Lasse, do you have a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that you need to jump through, or is it because you have that high-level political support that these can be ushered through a little bit easier?
No, there's plenty of bureaucracy. we don't have any lack of that. So maybe I just mention one thing, because I agree with you on the embodied carbon point, and what I like about the whole, because embodied carbon is becoming incredibly important in a lot of the markets that we're in, and it's really becoming something that everyone is trying to drive out carbon from the design process. And what I really like about that as a designer is that, first of all, it's in principle, it's kind of material and solution agnostic. I mean, you can come at it from different angles, and also it's sustainability. Let's say has in a long time has been focused on you can put some PVs on the roof or a little bit of green. This is kind of the core of what a building is: geometry, it's materials, it's grid sizes, like that. All of that has really a big influence on the carbon numbers, right? And we have there's a very big industry push in Denmark to regulate from the Danish industry, very broad, more than 600 companies. We just have had a carbon regulation from 1st of January, but essentially it's so the threshold number is so high that anyone can kind of go below it. But it was a good start, because it just, again, the conversation is then, okay, everyone needs to disclose their numbers, essentially. And now there's a very big industry push, and actually almost like a rally on Monday from the industry to tighten those numbers, which I kind of really appreciate, because I think even though it's filled with all kinds of paradoxes and it's not easy, I do think it's a good way to have these target numbers, because it allows the industry, if you can have some sort of unity behind it, to find different ways of getting there. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not complex, but I think in principle, as a kind of political lever, let's say, or tool, it is proving to be quite useful, both in Denmark and some of the other markets where we're working, where if you can agree what are the threshold numbers, what's our roadmap, what's our reduction roadmap looking like, that has been quite a good tool for people to get behind, I must say.
Yeah. Lasse, you've actually conveniently picked up on, I guess, a discussion that occurred, I think, in our second session today around that, the importance of, I guess, being clear in the setting of targets, but also matching those with timeframes and not jumping, overnight to the desired end goal, but to actually step it out over time and allow that space, I guess, for industry to then effectively beat the target that's been set, because they know that a tougher target is coming in the future.
Or even just prompting a conversation. So, carbon allows you to have room for those circular conversations, whereas before we have no reason to, even talk, carbon price, carbon value, those conversations have, until very, very recently been, impossible to have. So I think it's, you're right, it's a great prompter for more enlightening conversations to happen.
The importance of that roadmap. Alison, let's go pick up on what you were saying just before, in sort of preamble to that question. You were saying, carbon's perhaps something that we can do by, I guess, adjusting or using our current institutional structures. Yeah. Is there a point where the actual fundamental institutional framework starts to not work, and we need to, again, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. But is there, are there points where it's not just about increasing different, or adding different, or making calibrations of an existing institutional framework? At what point does it become a case for a redesign of a at a more systemic level?
I would say, going back to the cultural piece, our National Construction Code was, at this stage, the concept of the National Construction Code is that bottom fail-safe barrier. So it brings the lower level up, and it's your minimum standard. What we really want is all of our industry to be building good buildings and doing it in a great way. And you know, historically, we go back to, you know, the past is coming back to us. We've always had that as a mentality, and even in Sydney, where we are now, you can see beautiful buildings that were built not to the minimum standard, but that high quality. I think from a cultural piece, the education system and you know, the way that we build buildings, it's using the National Construction Code as an aspiration. And it's, okay, what do we do to meet the minimum standards, rather than aim higher and have that sort of minimum standard as the fail-safe. So that's a very big preamble to say that it doesn't mean that we need to, you know, throw the National Construction Code out the window, because it's a good vehicle for national consistency and getting all the states and territories talking and meeting those common objectives. I think it's the way that we need to structure our industry and have those conversations and, you know, collaborate, you know, proper forced collaboration to talk about how we can do better, you know, with the safety net well below.
Ralph, do you have thoughts on that, around the sort of that, I guess, that institutional change? And
yeah, well, there's a jurisdictional issue, of course, 3 levels of government all involved in the housing, et cetera, we've kind of talked a bit about earlier, and I think Europe also has a number of different jurisdictions, but it has a much larger market size, and so innovation is at a different scale, just straight away. We don't have the luxury of in a sense, of scale on our side, so I'm not sure we can afford the luxury. Now, there's a tension in here, but if I think about, you know, one state or even territory, you know, that's kind of embracing off-site fabrication and another one that's not ready, what does that do to the market? The market's got lots of different things to do in different states. It just makes transaction costs much higher, R&D much less successful, scale much more unattainable, new business models much more difficult, etc., etc. Now, the other side of that is you've got unlimited, in essence, different experiments going on. The problem is those experiments at a very small scale relative to what's required. So I think there's a tension here, and if we could contrast this with other jurisdictions overseas, and in this case we're talking about, I guess, Europe and Denmark, Europe in a geographical sense, not in a European Union sense, but Denmark, and just looking at the size of those markets and the number of jurisdictions and how lined up different players are, I think that's a worthwhile kind of sense-making discussion to have. What kind of innovation and change do we imagine is required for a circular economy housing system in Australia, and how are we organised in order to be able to enable private sector, architects, builders, the industry, if you like, to actually participate in it. And I think, you know, there's challenges with the scale that we have and the splintering of responsibilities that we have across Australia. Yeah.
If I could, I guess, throw in another point for discussion here, and it's come up again earlier on, the role of social housing as a location for innovation, and historically that's been the case. And I just want to, I guess, inject a couple of thoughts around that into the conversation. One is, I think it was Mike earlier today raised the point of, you know, there's a lot of money now flowing into social construction. There's a lot of opportunity. You know, that's a great thing, because it does, you know, provide that chance to actually experiment at scale, and historically we have experimented when we've built and delivered social housing. So potentially there's an opportunity there to do that again. On the other hand, it was also the previous time of injection of large scale amounts of money and very fast delivery of housing into social housing that has resulted in the very developments that Lasse is now pulling apart, and which the Victorian government obviously is, you know, taking down the towers, you know, for similar sort of reasons. So there's one of those tensions there around there's a risk here that we do it too fast and we don't think about it carefully enough, and we set up another problem. On the other hand, it is an opportunity to actually try something different that's outside of established practice in industry, and that it enables a bit of a shake-up in a way. Any thoughts around that?
One of the reasons I like Lasse's four-letter word, care.
Yep.
Is that I mean I wasn't here in the 50s, but I think technological modernism and the kind of the sense that everything's possible, and the sense that I get the sense that there's a slightly different zeitgeist here now, and I think bringing care to the table as an organising and a kind of a functional unit provides us with a slightly different proposition. And my hope would be that we can learn from what we've done, what we're dealing with as a legacy, and hopefully avoid the worst outcomes of what we do now and over the next 20 years for future generations. But look, we'll never fully know. I think it was on one of your slides, that quotable quote about all buildings are predictions and all predictions are wrong. So so we're kind of we're in this damned if we do and damned if we don't. And I think what we do is we just marshal what we think we need. And I quite like, as I said, I'll say it for the 10th time, care as a central idea. We try to operationalize that into practical realities of markets, of configuration of institutions, of codes and so on, and we get on with it.
And I think what was missing from back then is potentially more hoops to jump through in the sense of objectives and outcomes. So we want the social, we want the engagement with First Nations and co-design with First Nations. Government has the ability to put a lot more restrictions around the allocation of that funding. So the rules and the sustainability objectives, I think, can be embedded into the funding that's provided, and it's not a case of it's whatever you can, or however many you can build, the cheapest you can build it. It's these are our minimum objectives in terms of social environment, longevity, circular principles, and let's innovate and see how many we can produce with that as a absolute common denominator. So I think, I'm excited. I think what works with circular, and that I've seen, the leading examples, is when you do it at scale, you do it at the community or precinct level. That's where you can really think about the community and everything that goes into it. I know Anne Austin was on the stage earlier. Lend-Lease's, now not Lend-Lease, it's now Stocklands, but their Yarrabilba community, there was a lot of planning and foresight that went into it, even plantations to feed in the timber stock. So, to do it at that level, the community level, even the conversation about build to rent, if you've got that ownership structure and the responsibility over everything, it's actually easier to achieve than just piecemeal building units at different locations throughout a city. So exciting to see the potential of what could happen with the social housing.
And Lasse, can I guess turn that to you as well? I mean, the fact that the Circle House was a social, or is a social housing project, was that in a way fundamental to enabling it?
Yeah, I think the important thing about it, the fact that it was a social housing project, was two things. One is that it's sort of it's a pressure test on the economy of it. I mean, it's not something you can just do one time in a really expensive sort of pilot project. And the other thing is that the social housing companies are actually in a good position, or organizations as they are in a good position to sort of reap the benefits of designing circular, because they are in it in the long game. Let's say they are actually operating their buildings, right? And that's often the challenge with some of these things, especially when we when we talk about that sort of design for adaptability, that the value of that is actually only realized in the future, in a sense. And I think there was a person from the audience who asked me, how do I feel when we are part of sort of a project where a building is demolished? And I always feel a little bit bad, because I actually think it's a system failure in a way. And sometimes it's the right solution for the specific building. But it is a system failure, and I guess a big point of the circularity, which I think, to the point that was also made, which is interesting, is that it is trying to fix that sort of systemic. It's trying to kind of encompass how the new system should look, right? And in that sense, it's I think when we are designing social housing and building social housing today, it's just incredibly important, obviously, that we don't just do the same thing that kind of leaves us in the same situation in 20 years. I think that's a big point for me, because I mean, to some extent, there are some parts of the existing system where we just have to patch wherever we can, but we should, of course, aim to make it better in the future. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, it's time to start summing up, really. So, Lasse, thank you for all of your input, but I'm just going to, I guess, allow my two colleagues on the stand here the opportunity to, I guess, make some final comments before we wrap up.
I think I would just say this needs to be, the first conversation in a series of conversations. The time is so right to progress these. Looking at Michael, I see all the similarities. Australia's developing its refreshed national urban policy, and it's the opportunity to embed some really important values-based goals that can then filter down into our sort of building and regulatory systems. So just that, the time is now to get some really good change out there.
Thank you.
I mean, again, maybe I'll finish. I've said more than enough today, so but maybe I'll finish on that point of us paying as much attention to what I call the soft infrastructure of this transition to circular economy housing, as we do to the hard infrastructure, the pipes and wires, the rules, the regs, the markets, the so on and so forth, but really be cognizant of and aware of ourselves as people, with emotions and with values and with ethics, and in relation personally, but also in the organisations we work in and represent, and to be kind of respectful and resist the temptation to point the finger, and instead try to appreciate the challenges that we all face, and try to find the common language and the common touch points. I really do believe this institution building, and by that I mean the soft side of institution building. The hard side is ASBEC and named organisations, and that's crucial, don't get me wrong. But I think there's a soft side to this which we often pay too little attention to. So that would be my finishing.
Thank you, Ralph. Yeah.
Gambit.
Well, and everyone, please join me in thanking Lasse and Alison and Ralph for their contribution to this discussion. Lasse, thank you so much for your time and for joining us from on the ground in Copenhagen. We really appreciate the time and effort that you've put into this and the valuable contribution that you've made to our day today. And it's a really fitting way to end it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure and a very good conversation. Thank you so much. Bye.
Goodbye.
Have a great day.
Lovely. You can sit down as well, I guess, if you want to. Thank you. And I'll just very quickly wrap up for us. Look, thank you, everybody, for your role today and for your presence here. It's been a really, I think, high-quality discussion. We've found it really great to pull this group of people together. It's been a fascinating series of conversations on the stage, but also out around the food tables as well. That's been very valuable to us, and we do look forward to, I guess, delivering more research in this space. It has been, I think, as Ralph or someone pointed out earlier, there's been a lot of housing research done, and a lot of it by Ahuri, but it's very little of it really focused on, I guess, the built form and the built environment, and in particular these important issues of tackling climate change and working within our sort of ecological and resource limits on a finite planet. Well, just a couple of last-minute housekeeping things. The first one is to say, look, please, thank you for your time here, and please do give us your feedback. You will be emailed, I believe, the ability to provide feedback to us. So please do that. It really does help us, and we value your input. It helps us with future events. Speaking of which, I just wanted to mention our next conference, which is the Australian Homelessness Conference, which will be in Adelaide in August, on the 13th and 14th of August at the Adelaide Convention Centre. So any of you who have a role within the homelessness sector, of course, are most welcome and cordially invited to participate in that. And that's it. I'm just going to say thanks again. Appreciate everyone who's given their time and participated in today, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event, online or in person. Thank you.